October 14, 1943, over Schweinfurt, Germany. 291 American flying fortresses thunder toward ball-bearing factories deep in Reich territory. Their gunners have trained for months on clay pigeons and stationary targets. They know their weapons. They know their formations. They believe they're ready for combat. But when Messerschmitt 109s slash through the bomber stream at 300 miles per hour, American gunners freeze, spray bullets wildly, miss by hundreds of yards. Of those 291 bombers, 60 are blown from the sky. 17 more land as scrap metal. At Chelveston Airfield, ground crews wait for 15 aircraft from the 305th Bomb Group. 3 bombers return. 13 don't come home. Back in Texas, Major Cameron Fairchild reads the casualty reports and makes a decision the Army calls impossible. He's going to teach American gunners to shoot at their own planes with real bullets, and somehow they're going to survive it. The conventional wisdom said it couldn't be done. Fairchild thought conventional wisdom was killing American boys. The Texas sun beat down mercilessly on Harlingen Army Airfield as Major Cameron Fairchild watched another round of what the Army generously called aerial gunnery training. 12 young airmen bounced in the back of a deuce-and-a-half truck, clutching 12-gauge shotguns and squinting against the dust kicked up by the vehicle's tires. Clay pigeons sailed overhead, launched by hand-operated traps mounted on neighboring trucks. The gunners swayed with each pothole, trying to lead their targets while fighting motion sickness and choking on exhaust fumes. "Pull!" shouted the sergeant. Orange clay discs arced against the blue sky. Shotguns boomed. Most of the targets sailed serenely onward, untouched. When someone did connect, cheers erupted from the truck bed as if they just shot down the Red Baron himself. Fairchild pulled the brim of his service cap lower and shook his head. These boys would be heading to Europe in 6 months, manning the gun positions of flying fortresses and liberators. They'd face Messerschmitt fighters diving at them at 300 miles per hour from angles no clay pigeon had ever approached. They'd have to lead targets while their aircraft bucked through flak bursts and enemy fire, coordinating with 10 other gunners to create overlapping fields of fire that could actually hit something smaller than a barn door. The truck-mounted shotgun exercise bore about as much resemblance to aerial combat as a merry-go-round did to the Indianapolis 500. "How'd they do today, Sergeant Mills?" Fairchild asked as the convoy returned to the flight line. "Better than yesterday, sir." Peterson got 3 out of 10 and Williams managed 2. Mills mopped his forehead with a handkerchief. "Of course those clay birds weren't shooting back or trying to ram us." Fairchild nodded grimly in his office. Casualty reports from the European theater stacked higher each week. The 8th Air Force was bleeding experienced crews faster than replacement training could fill the gaps. Bomber groups limped back from missions over Germany with gunner positions shot empty, their occupants either dead or so badly wounded they'd never fly again. The few combat reports that made it through censorship painted a consistent picture. American gunners couldn't hit German fighters with any reliability. Accuracy rates hovered around 2% on a good day. The problem wasn't courage. American airmen pressed their attacks with suicidal determination, flying into walls of flak that could be seen from 50 miles away. The problem wasn't equipment. The Browning .50 caliber machine guns mounted in bomber turrets were mechanically reliable and packed devastating punch when they connected. The problem was training that prepared gunners for a war that existed only in peacetime manuals and optimistic planning documents. Static ground ranges where gunners fired at stationary targets taught marksmanship, but nothing about deflection shooting. Towed sleeve targets dragged behind friendly aircraft at predictable speeds, and altitudes gave students practice tracking moving objects, but bore no resemblance to the violent three-dimensional ballet of air-to-air combat. German fighters didn't approach in straight lines at constant speeds, conveniently maintaining range and bearing. They dove from the sun, rolled inverted through defensive fire, and broke away in climbing spirals that challenged even veteran pilots to follow. That evening, Fairchild spread engineering drawings across his desk and studied them by lamplight. For months, he'd been developing what his superiors considered an impossible concept: training that would allow student gunners to fire live ammunition at actual aircraft without killing the pilots inside. The idea had earned him skeptical looks from fellow officers and pointed suggestions that he might benefit from some leave time. The technical challenges seemed insurmountable. Any bullet capable of penetrating aircraft aluminum would kill the pilot on the first hit. Standard training ammunition was designed to maintain ballistic properties identical to combat rounds, which meant it retained the same lethal penetration. Creating a projectile that flew like a real bullet, but shattered harmlessly on impact violated basic principles of physics. Lead was soft and dense, perfect for maintaining momentum through resistant materials. Making it break apart on contact would require fundamental changes in composition that would inevitably alter flight characteristics. Even if such ammunition could be developed, what aircraft could survive being deliberately shot at? Military fighters were built for speed and maneuverability, not for absorbing gunfire. Their aluminum skins were thinner than a dime, designed to save weight rather than stop bullets. Fuel tanks, control cables, and engine components lay beneath minimal protection. A single lucky shot in the wrong place would send any conventional fighter spinning toward the ground in flames. But Fairchild had noticed something in the latest aircraft procurement reports. Bell Aircraft had developed a fighter called the P-63 King Cobra, intended as an improved version of their earlier P-39 Era Cobra. The Army Air Forces had tested the prototype and found it wanting, not fast enough to compete with the latest German fighters, not maneuverable enough to dogfight with Zeros, not reliable enough for long-range escort missions. Orders had been canceled in favor of P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that offered superior performance in every category that mattered for air-to-air combat, which meant hundreds of perfectly flyable P-63 airframes were sitting in storage, unwanted and available, aircraft that could be modified without affecting critical war production, fighters that could be armored and instrumented without anyone caring about weight penalties that would have been unacceptable in combat machines. The concept was taking shape in Fairchild's mind. Armor plating thick enough to stop rifle bullets, bulletproof glass for the cockpit, impact sensors to register hits without penetration, visual indicators to provide immediate feedback to gunners, paint schemes bright enough to ensure visibility at combat ranges. Most importantly, ammunition that would shatter on impact instead of penetrating, allowing realistic training without risking pilot lives. If such bullets could be developed, if they could match the ballistic properties of combat ammunition while fragmenting harmlessly on contact, then student gunners could finally practice against actual aircraft, performing realistic attack maneuvers. Fairchild closed the engineering folders and walked to his window. Outside, the flight line stretched empty under Texas stars. In a few hours, another class of student gunners would climb into training aircraft, ready to learn aerial gunnery from instructors who had never fired a shot in anger. They'd practice on toad sleeves and clay pigeons, building skills that would prove useless the first time a Focke-Wulf dove through their formation with all guns, blazing unless someone was willing to challenge conventional wisdom and risk everything on an idea the establishment considered impossible. Duke University's chemistry laboratory hummed with activity as Professor Paul Gross examined yet another failed bullet prototype under a magnifying glass. The projectile had shattered beautifully on impact with the steel test plate, fragmenting into harmless powder, just as intended. Unfortunately, it had also tumbled wildly during flight, arriving at the target sideways after describing a lazy arc that bore no resemblance to military ammunition ballistics. Number 217, announced his colleague Marcus Hobbs, making a notation in their test log. Bakelite mixture with 15% lead powder. Excellent fragmentation characteristics. Unacceptable flight stability. Fairchild leaned against the laboratory bench, watching the two professors work with methodical precision. For 6 months they had been pursuing what the Army Ordnance Department insisted was a scientific impossibility, creating a bullet that flew with the weight and trajectory of standard .30 caliber ammunition while shattering harmlessly on impact instead of penetrating. Every formulation that provided proper ballistic behavior proved too hard to fragment reliably. Every mixture that fragmented properly flew like a knuckleball thrown by a drunk pitcher. The fundamental problem remains unchanged, Gross explained, holding up 2 test bullets for comparison. Military ammunition achieves accuracy through dense, stable projectiles that maintain momentum. We need that same density and stability, but we also need the bullet to disintegrate on contact. Physics suggests these requirements are mutually exclusive. Hobbs nodded toward a rack of test samples. We've tried every combination of lead powder and binding agents available. Bakelite, shellac, wax, even experimental plastics provided by chemical companies. When we increase the binder content for better fragmentation, the bullet becomes too light and unstable. When we increase the lead content for proper ballistics, the projectile becomes too hard to break apart reliably. The challenge extended beyond simple material science. Standard military ammunition underwent rigorous quality control testing to ensure consistent performance across temperature ranges, storage conditions, and manufacturing tolerances. Combat rounds had to function reliably, whether fired in Arctic cold or tropical heat after months in damp storage compartments or immediate use from fresh supply deliveries. Creating frangible training ammunition that matched these performance standards while adding the completely contradictory requirement of harmless fragmentation seemed to violate fundamental principles of ballistics engineering. Fairchild picked up one of the failed prototypes, a sleek projectile that looked identical to combat ammunition, except for its slightly duller finish. What if we're approaching this backwards? Instead of trying to make a standard bullet that fragments, what if we design a fragmenting bullet that behaves like standard ammunition? Explain, said Gross, setting down his measuring instruments. Every attempt so far has started with lead and added binding agents. What if we start with the binding matrix and add lead until we achieve the right weight distribution? Fairchild sketched his concept on the laboratory's blackboard. Use bakelite as the primary structure, but weight it with lead particles sized and distributed to match the moment of inertia of military rounds. Hobbs studied the diagram thoughtfully. Interesting. Rather than lead held together by plastic, we'd have plastic weighted with lead. The ballistic properties would depend on overall mass distribution, not material hardness. The next series of tests proved more promising. By carefully controlling the size and distribution of lead particles within a bakelite matrix, the Duke team achieved projectiles that maintained stable flight while fragmenting dramatically on impact. The T-44 frangible bullet, as it came to be designated, weighed exactly as much as standard .30 caliber ammunition and followed nearly identical trajectory curves out to 500 yards. "Watch this," Hobbs said, loading a test round into a rifle mounted in a laboratory fixture. The bullet struck a steel plate with a sharp crack, dissolving into metallic dust and plastic fragments that scattered harmlessly to the floor. Complete fragmentation, zero penetration. Perfect trajectory match with military specifications. But solving the ammunition problem represented only half of Fairchild's challenge. Even the most realistic training bullets would prove worthless without aircraft capable of surviving deliberate gunfire from multiple directions simultaneously. Standard military fighters offered protection equivalent to wrapping a pilot in aluminum foil and hoping for the best. Their thin skins and closely packed components meant that any bullet penetrating the fuselage would likely damage something critical. The solution arrived in the form of procurement reports from Bell Aircraft Corporation. The P-63 King Cobra represented everything the Army Air Forces didn't want in a fighter. Too slow to catch German jets, too heavy to dogfight effectively, too complex to maintain in forward airfields. Production contracts had been canceled in favor of proven designs like the P-51 Mustang that offered superior combat performance, which made the King Cobra perfect for Fairchild's purposes. Hundreds of airframes sat in storage, mechanically sound but militarily useless. Unlike purpose-built training aircraft, the P-63 possessed the performance characteristics needed to simulate realistic fighter attacks. Its tricycle landing gear and enclosed cockpit provided modern features that student gunners would encounter on actual combat missions. Most importantly, its robust construction could accommodate the extensive modifications required for deliberate exposure to gunfire. The conversion process transformed the rejected fighter into something entirely new. Armor plating weighing over 1 ton replaced standard aluminum panels throughout the fuselage and wing surfaces. The cockpit received bulletproof glass an inch thick, turning the pilot's position into an armored capsule capable of stopping rifle bullets from any angle. 109 impact sensors installed beneath the armor detected bullet strikes without allowing penetration, connected to a central recording system that tracked hit locations and times with scientific precision. The most visible modification was a red light bulb mounted in the propeller hub, connected to the impact sensor network through slip rings that maintained electrical contact despite the spinning propeller. When training bullets struck the aircraft, the light flashed immediately, providing instant feedback to gunners who could finally see the results of their shooting in real time. Designation RP-63, announced the Bell Aircraft project manager reading from the official modification specifications. The R stands for restricted since these aircraft are limited to training missions. Unofficially, the pilots are calling them pinballs because of that flashing red light. Fairchild examined the completed prototype painted bright orange for maximum visibility against sky backgrounds. The aircraft looked like no fighter ever built, bristling with armor plates and sensor equipment that added weight and drag no combat pilot would tolerate. But for training purposes, those same modifications represented revolutionary capabilities that would finally allow realistic aerial gunnery instruction. "How many can you convert?" Fairchild asked. "As many as you can get approved through procurement. We have 300 King Cobra airframes in storage, and the modification work provides employment for our factory crews between combat aircraft contracts." The impossible bullet had become reality. The flying target aircraft was taking shape on the production line. All that remained was finding pilots willing to fly deliberately into streams of gunfire and convincing the Army that shooting at their own planes represented the future of aerial gunnery training. The recruitment briefing at Del Rio Army Airfield drew a crowd of pilots who assumed they were being offered another routine training assignment. Captain Ivan Hickman sat in the third row, idly sketching aircraft modifications in his logbook margins while the briefing officer droned through standard operational procedures. The job sounded straightforward enough. Test pilot work involving modified P-63 fighters and advanced gunnery training scenarios. "The aircraft will be equipped with special armor plating and impact sensors," the colonel continued. "Your mission will be to simulate realistic fighter attacks against bomber formations while student gunners engage you with live ammunition." Hickman's pencil stopped moving. Around the room, conversations died as pilots processed what they had just heard. Someone in the back row cleared his throat loudly. "Sir, did you say live ammunition?" "Affirmative. You'll be flying into actual gunfire from multiple directions simultaneously. The frangible bullets will fragment harmlessly on impact with your aircraft's armor, but the ballistic properties match standard military rounds exactly. This represents the most realistic aerial gunnery training ever attempted." A lieutenant near the front raised his hand tentatively. "What's the casualty projection for pilots, sir?" "Unknown. This is experimental territory. We're looking for volunteers only. No one will be assigned to this program involuntarily." The room erupted in nervous laughter and whispered conversations. Hickman found himself oddly intrigued by the concept. After logging over 2,000 flight hours in various training roles, the prospect of genuinely challenging flying appealed to him more than another series of routine instruction missions. The technical aspects fascinated him as well. Deliberately exposing an aircraft to sustained gunfire required precise flying and constant situational awareness that would test skills no peacetime training had ever demanded. "I'm interested," he announced, standing up. "When do we start?" Over the following weeks, volunteers trickled in from bases across the country. The selection process proved remarkably informal. Anyone willing to sign the liability waivers and pass standard flight physicals could join the program. Most recruits fell into two distinct categories that seemed to have little in common beyond willingness to risk their lives for experimental training concepts. The first group consisted of young pilots fresh from advanced flight training, men in their early 20s who possessed the reflexes and confidence that came from believing themselves invulnerable. Lieutenant Robert Chen had graduated flight school just 6 months earlier and viewed the pinball program as an adventure that would distinguish him from his peers. "How dangerous can it really be?" he asked during his initial interview. "They wouldn't put us in aircraft that couldn't handle the mission." The second group included combat veterans returning from European and Pacific theaters, pilots who had survived fighter sweeps over Germany or carrier operations in the Pacific. These men brought hard-earned wisdom about aerial combat, but also psychological scars that made the prospect of being shot at by Americans seem almost surreal. Lieutenant John Aranos represented this veteran contingent. After completing 82 missions over Europe in P-47 Thunderbolts, he had returned to the United States, expecting routine instructor assignments at stateside training bases. The pinball program offered something entirely different, a chance to use his combat experience in service of training the next generation of aircrew more effectively than he had been prepared for his own combat tour. "First time I climbed into that orange King Cobra, I was definitely twitchy," Arenos admitted to Hickman during pre-flight preparations. "Spent 2 years dodging German gunfire. Now I'm volunteering to let American kids shoot at me. There's some kind of irony in that." The initial training flights revealed the psychological adjustment required for deliberately flying into friendly fire. Even experienced combat pilots found themselves instinctively flinching when muzzle flashes erupted from bomber gun positions, despite intellectual knowledge that the bullets would fragment harmlessly against their armor. Radio communications during early missions reflected the surreal nature of the training scenario. Pinball leader, this is Fortress 12. Student gunners report ready to engage. Roger, Fortress 12 beginning attack. Run from your 9 o'clock high. Try not to hit anything important. Understood, Pinball leader. We'll aim for the armored sections. The aircraft modifications proved their worth during the first live-fire exercises. Hickman's RP-63 absorbed dozens of direct hits during a single training mission, the impact sensors registering each strike while the red light in his propeller hub flashed continuously inside the armored cockpit. The sound of bullets striking his aircraft resembled heavy rain on a tin roof, persistent but not alarming once he adjusted to the experience. Control, Pinball leader, taking multiple hits from all quadrants. Aircraft handling normally, all systems green. These kids are actually hitting something for once. The immediate feedback provided by the flashing light revolutionized gunnery training in ways that surprised even Fairchild. Student gunners could see instantly whether their aim was accurate, allowing them to adjust their shooting technique in real time, rather than waiting for post-mission analysis that might come hours or days later. The visual confirmation of successful hits provided psychological reinforcement that built confidence and encouraged continued improvement. More importantly, the training exposed fundamental problems with existing gunnery instruction that static targets and towed sleeves had never revealed. When pinball aircraft approached bomber formations at realistic attack speeds and angles, student gunners discovered that their carefully practiced techniques from ground school proved inadequate for three-dimensional aerial combat. Leading targets required intuitive understanding of relative motion that could only be developed through repeated exposure to actual aircraft maneuvering unpredictably in 3 dimensions. "The difference is incredible," reported Sergeant Mills after observing his first pinball training mission. "These boys are learning to track targets and calculate deflection angles instinctively. Ground training never taught them to coordinate with other gunners or manage ammunition conservation under pressure." By early 1945, the program had expanded to 4 bases across the southern United States, facilities in Florida, Texas, Arizona, and Nevada, where weather conditions allowed year-round flying operations. Each base operated multiple RP-63 aircraft and maintained detailed training schedules that rotated bomber crews through increasingly complex gunnery scenarios. The volunteers who flew the pinball missions developed a unique camaraderie based on shared experience of their unusual job. Unlike bomber crews who faced enemy fire as an unavoidable hazard of combat missions, pinball pilots deliberately sought out situations where friendly forces would shoot at them with scientific precision. The psychological adjustment required constant reinforcement through humor and mutual support. "You know you're in a specialized field," Hickman observed, "when your biggest occupational hazard is friendly fire, and that's exactly what you're trying to achieve." Chen nodded, reviewing his post-mission damage report. "Took 43 hits today, all in the armored sections. Students are definitely improving their accuracy. I actually had to break off the attack run because they were tracking me too, effectively." The success of individual training missions began generating requests for expanded programs from bomber groups preparing for deployment overseas. Combat commanders who had witnessed the devastating effectiveness of German fighter attacks wanted their gunners trained on pinball aircraft before facing the real thing over European targets. Lieutenant Mike Patterson learned the hard way that pinball flying demanded constant vigilance when enthusiastic student gunners forgot the boundaries of their training mission. During what should have been a routine attack simulation, Patterson made the mistake of performing a low-speed pass alongside a B-24 formation, matching their airspeed to give the gunners an easier tracking solution. The gesture of instructor consideration nearly killed him. "Think you can hit me now?" he radioed confidently, maintaining formation position just 50 yards off the bomber's starboard wing. The RP-63's bright orange paint scheme gleamed in the afternoon sun, presenting an unmistakable target that even novice gunners should be able to engage successfully. The response came in the form of concentrated fire from 6 gun positions simultaneously. Bullets hammered his aircraft from nose to tail, as student gunners discovered that a stationary target made gunnery training surprisingly easy. Patterson's cockpit filled with the sound of impacts against unarmored sections as rounds found gaps in the protective plating that had never been designed to handle broadside attacks. "Breaking off! Breaking off!" Patterson shouted into his radio, pulling into a steep climbing turn that took him away from the bomber formation. Behind him, enthusiastic cheering erupted from the B-24's intercom as gunners celebrated their unexpected accuracy. Patterson's engine temperature gauge climbed rapidly toward the red line as cooling system damage became apparent. Emergency landing procedures at Del Rio Army Airfield revealed the vulnerability of pinball aircraft when attacked from unexpected angles. The armor protection had been designed primarily for head-on approaches that simulated realistic fighter attack profiles. Side attacks, especially at close range, could find numerous gaps in coverage where weight considerations had required compromises in protection. 17 hits in unarmored sections, reported the ground crew chief, pointing to bullet holes clustered around the engine compartment and rear fuselage. Cooling system punctured in 3 places, control cable nicked, and the radio antenna shot away. You were lucky none of those rounds hit anything more critical. The incident highlighted fundamental safety protocols that needed immediate implementation. Pinball pilots received strict briefings about maintaining proper attack angles that kept them within their aircraft's protected envelope. Student gunners underwent additional instruction about engagement limitations and the importance of ceasing fire when target aircraft broke away from attack runs. More dangerous were the occasions when inexperienced gunners continued firing after pinball aircraft had completed their attack passes and begun climbing away from bomber formations. The RP-63's armor protection covered frontal and side approaches, but left the tail section largely unprotected to save weight. Bullets striking the rear fuselage could damage flight controls, communication equipment, or engine accessories located outside the armored envelope. Captain Ivan Hickman experienced this hazard during a training mission over Arizona, when student gunners became so focused on their targets that they ignored radio calls to cease fire. His RP-63 absorbed multiple hits in the tail section as he climbed away from a B-17 formation, severing elevator control cables that nearly sent the aircraft into an unrecoverable dive. "Control, Pinball 2 declaring emergency," Hickman transmitted, fighting to maintain level flight with severely compromised pitch control. Taking hits in unarmored tail section, losing elevator authority, requesting immediate landing clearance and crash, equipment standing by. The emergency landing demonstrated both the aircraft's fundamental soundness and the narrow margins that separated successful training missions from potential disasters. Hickman managed to maintain control through careful power management and rudder inputs, bringing the damaged pinball down on Luke Army Airfield's main runway with minimal additional damage. Post-flight inspection revealed that 2 more hits in the tail section would have completely severed his elevator controls. "This is exactly why we need better fire discipline training," Fairchild observed, examining the battle damage. "Student gunners are getting so excited about actually hitting their targets that they're forgetting basic engagement rules. We need clearer protocols for when to shoot and when to stop shooting." The solution involved installing additional visual signals on pinball aircraft that would clearly indicate when attack runs were complete. Colored smoke dispensers mounted on the wings provided unmistakable signals that gunners should cease fire immediately. Radio procedures became more standardized with specific phrasing that left no ambiguity about engagement status. Despite these safety incidents, the program's effectiveness became undeniable as training statistics accumulated. Bomber crews that completed pinball gunnery training showed dramatically improved accuracy rates compared to units trained exclusively on conventional targets. More importantly, they demonstrated better teamwork and fire discipline under pressure, crucial skills that static target practice had never developed. "The difference is like night and day," reported Colonel James Wright, commanding officer of the 441st Bomb Group after completing pinball training. "My gunners are tracking targets instinctively now, leading properly, working together as a team. When we deployed to England, they engaged German fighters with confidence and effectiveness that surprised even veteran squadrons. By summer 1945, the scale of pinball operations had reached industrial proportions. 300 RP-63 aircraft had been converted for training use, distributed across training bases from Florida to California. The frangible bullet production line at Bakelite Corporation manufactured 40 to 45 million T-44 rounds monthly, consuming significant quantities of lead and plastic materials that required priority allocations from wartime production boards. Each training mission now involved elaborate choreography, designed to maximize learning while minimizing safety risks. Bomber formations loaded with student gunners and 2,000 rounds per aircraft would rendezvous with pinball flights at predetermined altitudes and coordinates. The RP-63 pilots would execute carefully planned attack sequences that exposed gunners to realistic target presentation while remaining within their aircraft's protective envelope. "Attack run number 3, Hickman announced over the radio. "Coming in from your 11 o'clock high-diving attack profile. Engage when I reach effective range. Cease fire when I break left and climb." The red lights in the pinball propeller hubs flashed steadily as student gunners found their marks with increasing regularity. Radio chatter filled with hit confirmations and accuracy assessments that provided immediate feedback impossible with conventional training methods. Gunners could see their tracers converging on target aircraft and watch the visual confirmation of successful impacts in real time. 6 hits on the fuselage, 4 on the starboard wing, reported the training observer aboard the bomber. "Excellent deflection shooting, Henderson. You're finally getting the hang of leading a diving target." The psychological impact of realistic training proved as important as the technical skills being developed. Student gunners who had successfully engaged maneuvering aircraft under pressure arrived at combat theaters with confidence that ground training had never provided. They understood the three-dimensional nature of aerial combat in ways that could only be learned through direct experience. But even as the program reached peak effectiveness, larger technological changes were making the entire concept of manual aerial gunnery obsolete. The new B-29 Superfortress incorporated centralized fire control systems with analog computers that automatically calculated target lead and range corrections. Human gunners became system operators rather than marksmen, managing weapons controlled by mechanical brains that could track targets more precisely than any human reflexes. The future belonged to automation and guided weapons, not to young men with keen eyes and steady hands learning to shoot down enemy fighters through skill and courage. The telegram arrived at Fairchild's office on August 15, 1945, bearing news that should have represented triumph, but felt strangely hollow. Japan had surrendered unconditionally following the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Pacific War was over. After 4 years of global conflict, American forces would finally stop dying in foreign skies. Fairchild set the telegram aside and walked to his window overlooking the Del Rio training complex. Below him, orange RP-63 Pinballs taxied toward the runway for another day of live-fire exercises. Student gunners climbed into B-24 bombers, checking their weapons and adjusting their equipment with the practiced efficiency that months of realistic training had developed. The red lights would flash again today, confirming hits with the immediate feedback that had revolutionized aerial gunnery instruction. But who would these skills protect now? The Luftwaffe had been destroyed months earlier, its experienced pilots dead or grounded by fuel shortages that left Germany's remaining aircraft as static targets for Allied strafing runs. Japanese air power had evaporated under the sustained bombing campaign that culminated in atomic destruction. The enemy fighters that had torn through American bomber formations over Schweinfurt and Regensburg existed now only in intelligence files and combat veterans' memories. "Major Fairchild." His aide knocked tentatively on the office door. "Colonel Morrison wants to see you immediately. Something about program evaluation and future planning." Morrison's office buzzed with activity as staff officers compiled reports and updated organizational charts that reflected the Army's rapid transition to peacetime operations. Training programs across the country faced immediate scrutiny as budget priorities shifted from wartime expansion to demobilization efficiency. Every dollar spent on specialized instruction needed justification in terms of future military requirements rather than current combat necessity. "Sit down, Cameron," Morrison said, gesturing toward a chair piled high with administrative folders. "We need to discuss the pinball program status now that hostilities have ended. The preliminary numbers are impressive. Accuracy improvements of 300% over conventional training methods, enhanced crew coordination, better ammunition discipline. Your innovation worked exactly as advertised." Fairchild waited for the inevitable qualification that would follow such praise. In his experience, military bureaucracy never delivered unqualified good news. especially regarding experimental programs that had challenged established doctrine. However, Morrison continued, we're facing budget realities that make continuation difficult to justify. Congress is demanding immediate reductions in military spending, and specialized training programs are obvious targets for elimination. The question becomes whether pinball training provides sufficient peacetime value to warrant continued funding. The irony was lost on no one in the room. Fairchild's system had finally achieved the training effectiveness that combat commanders had desperately needed during the war's darkest periods. Student gunners now hit maneuvering targets with accuracy rates that would have saved thousands of lives over European and Pacific battlefields. The technical problems that had seemed insurmountable in 1942 had been solved through persistence and innovative thinking that combined academic research with practical engineering. But military aviation was evolving beyond the need for such skills. The Boeing B-29 Superfortress represented the future of strategic bombing, incorporating centralized fire control systems that removed individual marksmanship from the aerial gunnery equation. Analog computers calculated target lead and range automatically, directing remotely controlled gun turrets with mechanical precision that exceeded human capabilities. The gunner's role shifted from marksman to systems operator, monitoring instruments and managing equipment rather than aiming weapons through iron sights. Have you seen the performance data from the B-29 operations over Japan? Morrison asked, sliding a classified report across his desk. Computer-directed fire control systems achieved hit rates approaching 15% against maneuvering targets. That's 7 times better than even our best. Pinball-trained gunners could manage under similar conditions. The numbers told a story of technological obsolescence that rendered human skills secondary to mechanical calculation. While Fairchild students had struggled to achieve 3% accuracy through intensive training, analog computers effortlessly surpassed their best efforts by calculating ballistic solutions, too complex for human minds to process during combat. The future belonged to automation, guided weapons, and electronic systems that could engage targets at ranges and speeds beyond human reaction capabilities. Even more revolutionary developments loomed on the horizon. Jet aircraft were achieving speeds that made conventional defensive gunnery impossible, regardless of computer assistance. Guided missiles promised to eliminate the need for close-range dogfighting that had defined air combat since the Wright brothers first took flight. Heat-seeking weapons and radar-guided rockets would transform aerial warfare into a contest between electronic systems rather than human pilots and gunners. Lieutenant John Aranos knocked on Morrison's door, still wearing his flight suit after completing the morning's training mission. His 82 combat missions over Europe had ended with the German surrender in May, but he had continued flying pinball training flights to help prepare crews who would never face enemy fire. The irony of his situation reflected the program's broader obsolescence, a combat veteran teaching skills for a war that no longer existed. Sir, the students from today's mission want to know about their deployment schedules, Aranos reported. They've completed advanced gunnery training and feel ready for combat assignments. I'm not sure how to explain that there aren't any combat assignments available anymore. Morrison nodded grimly. That's exactly the problem we're facing, Lieutenant. We've created the most effective aerial gunnery training program in military history, just as aerial gunnery itself becomes irrelevant to modern warfare. The transition had happened faster than anyone anticipated. In January 1945, bomber crews still faced determined fighter opposition over Germany and Japan. By August, both enemy air forces had ceased meaningful resistance, their pilots either dead or grounded by lack of fuel and aircraft. The skills that had required years to develop properly were no longer needed for American survival, making continued investment in specialized training difficult to justify to budget-conscious legislators. What about the equipment? Fairchild asked. 300 converted aircraft, millions of rounds of frangible ammunition, training facilities at 4 bases that represent significant capital investment that could support other programs. The RP-63s will be declared surplus and sold for scrap, Morrison replied. The airframes are too specialized for conventional use and storage costs exceed their potential value as training aircraft. The frangible ammunition production line has already been shut down. Viclite Corporation needs their manufacturing capacity for civilian products now that wartime contracts are ending. By December 1946, the pinball program had officially ceased operations. The last orange-painted RP-63 made its final training flight on a cold morning in Nevada. Its red light flashing one last time as student gunners engaged a target that represented the end of an era in military aviation. The aircraft was ferried to a storage facility in Arizona, where it joined hundreds of other wartime innovations that had proven successful just as they became unnecessary. Fairchild received new orders assigning him to conventional training operations at Maxwell Army Airfield in Alabama. His personnel file noted his successful development of innovative gunnery training methods, commending his initiative in solving technical problems that had challenged military aviation. But the commendation felt hollow, recognition for achievements that had arrived too late to serve their intended purpose. The men who might have been saved by better gunnery training lay buried in military cemeteries across Europe and the Pacific, their lives lost to inadequate preparation that Fairchild's innovation had finally addressed. His success represented a victory over institutional inertia and technical impossibility. But it came at the cost of knowing that earlier implementation might have prevented thousands of deaths over German and Japanese targets. The pinball program had proven that challenging conventional wisdom could produce revolutionary results when innovative thinking met persistent effort. But it had also demonstrated the tragic gap between military needs and military solutions, showing how bureaucratic caution and technical skepticism could delay life-saving innovations until they were no longer needed.